From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Ahead today, K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will discuss how to properly soil test crop fields following fall harvest, saying that errors in sampling can lead to a misread on soil nutrient content. He talks about how to gather a representative sample. Then K-State's Joel DeRouchey follows up with a word on distributing livestock waste on crop ground as a nutrient source here in the fall, understanding what the true nutrient value of that product is, and then applying it accordingly. Also today, K-State's Ken Odde will preview the Animal Sciences and Industry Department's 2017 Family and Friends Reunion. Coming up soon, pre-registration due this Friday. And with Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus Vander Hoeven. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Agriculture Today continues now with more on crop nutrient management from the standpoint of utilizing a readily available resource to many of you farmer feeders out there in the way of livestock waste applied to crop ground. Now, that's something that needs to be managed more carefully than you might think. And to lend some thoughts along that line today, we brought by Research and Extension Livestock Specialist out of K-State, Joel DeRouchey. Joel, this is the time where cattle producers and otherwise may well be cleaning out feeding areas and considering using that waste as a nutrient resource. It is a practical idea.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me on today. Yeah, manure, as all livestock producers know, is a valuable nutrient resource for their operations. And certainly as we look at some of the potential cost savings from substituting commercial fertilizer, it's certainly one of the reasons that most of our livestock operations remain in business is to help offset those production costs on their cropping side by utilizing the manure that's generated on the livestock side of the business. And so regardless of size, operations need to make sure that we're utilizing that resource to us available in our operations efficiently to help our bottom line.
Before we talk about actual application of the waste as a nutrient, the practice of cleaning out lots, do producers need to be particular about that?
You know, the biggest thing, as most producers know, is just trying to keep those feedlot surfaces groomed where we can minimize, the amount of mud and extra residue that once it gets deposited. And certainly that's easier said than done. Scraping lots is no easy task for most producers, so we're not trying to get too aggressive and start removing soil and then cause us problems maybe with application and ultimately causing holes where the water doesn't drain out of those pens very efficiently. So the biggest thing when we clean the pens is to provide just a uniform scrape where we can maintain our water drainage off of that after rainfall events to minimize the amount of mud. We can, within pens, pull that manure up into mounds that many producers do, then remove or reduce the size of those mounds or those manure piles if we don't have much storage outside the pens. Certainly as we clean those pens, hopefully 2 to 3 times a year to minimize, again, that manure just turns into mud on these bigger rainfall events, to basically keep that separated out to keep a better pen surface for the growth and health of those cattle growing in those pens.
All right. Well, Joel, we talk about the nutritive value of livestock waste, but does one need to have an actual firm idea of that value through an analysis?
Yes, we can very easily, just like a soil test, just like a feed analysis, commercial labs are set up very readily to do manure analysis. And really what becomes important is generally in an operation we find that manure analysis doesn't change greatly year to year. So oftentimes oftentimes if we're scraping and hauling and applying, it maybe isn't necessary that we have this specific manure that we're applying this year, but rather if we have some history of knowing what that nutrient content is, because generally we need to do the planning before we start spreading. And so it's kind of the chicken or the egg, and oftentimes we can rely on history of what our manure sample looks like, and that's regardless of the species of the manure that it comes from. Then we develop our plan to where we're going to spread it, how much is need to be spread on those particular fields on a given year. So we can certainly rely on the history of analysis, but then this year, while we're applying, getting a good manure analysis, having it conducted, and then we can use it next year, or we can still use it in this manure application season, but we don't have to, in my opinion, have the analysis from this year's manure to go on this year's field right now.
One thing, though, as an aside, as one would contemplate this practice, they need to be sure that all the numbers add up, that it is a paying proposition that has to do with the availability, the distance of the haul, and so forth, compared to a commercial fertilizer application.
Absolutely. If we have to haul great distances, or if we, looking at our economics, as we look to offset costs of commercial fertilizer, it absolutely has to pencil. And there we look at both the, if an operation is doing it themselves, we need to look at the costs of that scraping, hauling, and spreading, whether they have their own equipment or whether it has to be done on a custom basis, and does that balance out compared to commercial fertilizer? Oftentimes we see producers utilize the fields closest to their operation just due to the hauling costs, and that makes perfect sense. But that's where it balances in then to make sure we're putting the correct amount out. And really what we're focused on is generally the amount of phosphorus going out. We certainly want to balance the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and then if we need potassium in some cases coming from the manure or commercial fertilizers. But practically many producers will apply manure. Oftentimes the solid manure gets applied on a 3 to 4 year application rate for phosphorus. So we actually bank up some phosphorus in the soil. At the same time, we become short of the total amount of nitrogen we need. Then producers practically come in with anhydrous or some sort of nitrogen source to supplement, but don't need to come back in with different phosphorus or potassium sources because there's enough from the manure for a 2 to 4 year period. So again, it's balancing that, and that's where the soil test needs to come into play to understand what we may need during and after manure application on that specific field.
And you're alluding to this, the least stable of the big three there when it comes to livestock waste is in fact nitrogen. One shouldn't bank on that waste as a prime nitrogen source if they're applying in the fall.
Correct. Within nitrogen, there's different forms, and one of them is in the available or the ammonia form initially. And that's where the smell that people will smell if manure generally comes from, and that's part of the nitrogen that's leaving that manure. And absolutely, depending how we apply, certainly in no-till systems, as we apply manure, we're going to lose the majority of that nitrogen just simply due to nitrification and dissolving off of that manure into the air. Now, when we're in our tillage systems, it's certainly best after we apply manure to come in within a day or two and till that manure into the ground, and then we'll capture the vast majority of that nitrogen to be used next spring. So it depends on how we manage our cropping system. Are we incorporating that solid manure into the soil? And if not, we still have the phosphorus and potassium and micronutrients and the organic matter that comes with, but we will lose a good portion of the nitrogen. And that still comes back into our economics of how we balance that if we need to come in with some starter or top dress nitrogen as we begin next year's crop.
So then, all that considered, how important is even distribution of the product across the field then? If you're not incorporating in particular, is that a critical thing to focus on?
It is, Eric. And as any farmer is going to know, any area that we miss fertilizing, that will certainly show up next summer, whether you're doing that with commercial fertilizer or manure. You'll see that in those fields. And so one of the things with manure is if we apply too lightly in terms of not enough density of that manure, in case of solid manure, we may not be as uniform across, and then we could end up with patches or areas not getting as much nutrients as they need. So generally, when it comes to spreading solid manure, most most producers would say that we need at least 10, if not 15 tons per acre in an application. And that way we can get a more uniform manure spread across a given acre. And thus then we can have more confidence that those nutrients will be there as we get into spring planting. So yes, that becomes important. Now, for our liquid application, often swine producers, or if you have lagoons, if that liquid's going through a center pivot, we understand then we have a fairly uniform application of that waste. For our swine producers and those that have some deep pits or more concentrated manure, those are often injected straight into the ground. And so, again, in those cases, we understand that it's certainly more uniform when we're using a drag line and doing some sort of tillage to inject that liquid manure directly in. In those cases, we do get very uniform application. So it's back to manure type and how we spread. For some of our smaller operations that don't have enough manure generated to cover an entire field, oftentimes a good practice there is to still, instead of spreading a very thin level over a very large area, we probably aren't getting a lot of nutrient benefit because of the scarcity of that manure across a larger landmass. Oftentimes it would be recommended to apply that manure more at an agronomic rate on a smaller portion of that field, and then next year come into the portion that didn't have it, and so on. And thus, we're getting a greater concentration and getting more benefit from that versus being scattered out, when then we have less confidence that we have enough nutrients to make a difference, and then you're still oftentimes in those cases coming back in with full levels of commercial fertilizer application. So our true net savings is basically non-existent in those cases.
And that comes back to the value of what we've been talking about during this first half hour of the broadcast, a soil test to know where you stand.
Absolutely. And manure is certainly one of the assets that is developed on a livestock operation. We need to be taken into account to offset our other input costs.
For further information on maximizing the utility of livestock waste as a crop nutrient source, your local extension office can access those materials for you. And Joel, appreciate the word on this, timely that it is. Thank you.
Thank you. And as you said, if producers have questions, please contact myself or your local extension service.
Very good. That's Joel DeRouchey. He's a livestock specialist with K-State Research and Extension. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We'll break away now and be back with more here on the K-State Radio Network.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network. We're glad to have you aboard for Agriculture Today. Into nutrient management for crop ground during this first half hour, and how to know where your fields stand nutrient-wise as we wrap up another cropping season. This is a good time, says our guest, to enact a soil test regimen, and we'll talk about what that entails now with Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. He's a nutrient management specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Having a representative soil sample, that's the goal, Dorivar, and you suggest, as a matter of fact, in a recent e-update article, that can pose challenges to the producer.
Yes, Eric. There are some things that we need to keep in mind when we are trying to collect good soil sample that ultimately is going to give us good information to make that decision for the nutrient management, fertilizer application. And one of the main challenges we often see is, of course, the variability that we have in the field. And that variability may come from different sources. We do have small-scale variability in the fields that may be coming from, for example, fertilizer placement like phosphorus or other things that may be more of a small scale. And then we have more of a bigger scale variability that may be related to the topography, maybe past management that we have in those fields, rotation, and so on. So those are things that we need to keep in mind. So that if we're talking about the large-scale variability, of course, the ideal thing would be to split the fields in different parts and basically target those parts of the field or different fields in a different way in terms of collecting samples for those areas. But then the next component to that is the small-scale variabilities, basically what we see there in terms of variability from basically just a few feet in the field. One of the key factors there that we need to keep in mind is how many subsamples we are collecting that's going to go into that one sample. And that's really the way to overcome that small-scale variability. And ideally, we typically say, for an area that you are sampling, we want to see at least 15 to 20 subsamples. That will be a soil core that's going to go into that sample that you are sending it to the lab. At that point, you start to basically have a representative sample, a uniform sample that's going to give you the average value for that particular area that you are planning to treat. So the key there is really take as many subsamples as possible. A minimum of 15 to 20 is something that we recommend. Less than that, we will probably see a lot of variability that ultimately is going to affect your management, fertility management.
The other variable here that needs to be considered, the depth of that core sample, and that will depend, you say, on the nutrient you're interested in.
Yes, especially a lot of our production system in Kansas is going to be minimum tillage, no-till systems, and we know in that kind of situation we are not mixing the soil. We have a certain level of stratification, not just of nutrients but also pH, for example. And so for immobile nutrients like phosphorus, potassium, zinc, KSA recommendation is that we want to collect a 6-inch sampling depth. Other labs may be recommending a different sampling depth, and I think that's fine. The key is really, again, try to be consistent. As we are collecting that sample across the field, be consistent, and again, that way we are not introducing another variability that's coming from that stratification of nutrients that we see in the field. So, yeah, that's another dimension of variability that we have, not just the variability across the field, but also what happening, in the soil profile in terms of nutrients and especially the immobile nutrients. Just touch a little bit on pH. pH is one of those things that sampling depth can also actually can be different depending on what kind of systems we have and what is the purpose of that analysis. In the case of pH in no-till system, more likely we're going to be putting that lime on the surface. We're not going to incorporate because of the no-till system. So it has a lot of value to maybe have a more shallow sample, perhaps a 3-inch sampling that could have a lot more value for a lime recommendation because, again, that lime is not going to move much in the profile. 2.5, maybe up to 3 inches in some cases, but that will be it. So again, in that kind of situation, we want to take a different sampling depth of about 3 inches. Will have much more value. On the other hand, if we're talking about mobile nutrients and
nitrogen being primary among them.
Nitrogen would be one of the main ones. And again, in Kansas, we do see a lot of value from those profile sampling for mobile nutrient. Like you mentioned, nitrogen is one of the key ones. But we also see a lot of value in chloride in certain parts of the state. Sulfur is something that we see more and more. In that kind of scenario where we are dealing with a mobile nutrient, then we want to really look at something profile sampling, ideally about 24 inches. I know in some situations with dry soils and so on, we may not be able to do that. But I know many producers that will collect 18 inches or something, whatever is possible, and it still has a lot of value in terms of seeing a little bit more what you have in that entire profile for those mobile nutrients.
When one is sampling, does one need to follow the crop row, or does one want to vary up that sampling pattern as they cross the field, Dorivar?
Yes, that's another excellent point, and ideally what we want to do is to try to cover as much area as we can in that particular area that you're trying to manage. And we usually try to get what basically a random sampling, if you will. You don't want to, certainly you want to avoid taking only on the row and only between the row. Ideally, we want to have a combination of those in a way that, we end up with a representative sample in average for that particular area. If we do follow, for example, in strip till or systems like that where we're putting the fertilizer in the row, if we are taking only from the row, of course, the numbers are going to be different. So, again, we want to keep that in mind and, of course, take a representative sample from the entire area.
All right. Well, you work directly with the soil testing laboratory here at K-State, and that laboratory receives multiple samples any given week. Sometimes those samples come in in a condition where it's hard to get a read on what's going on because the sampling method wasn't up to snuff or the sample wasn't submitted properly. So there are certain guidelines to follow there.
Yes, that's a very good point, Eric, and it's something that we have to keep in mind. Of course, we talk about the how we collecting those samples in the field, and that's really the first step, and there's potential for a lot of variability in how we are collecting that sample. But how are we processing that sample? How are we getting that sample to the lab is another key component that we need to keep in mind. And there are a few things that we always emphasize to our producers and extension personnel who send samples to our lab. And one of them is, of course, once we are collecting a representative good sample, make sure and we use the proper tools in terms of avoiding any potential contamination. That's always going to be a key. And that could be particularly important for, say, for example, some of the trace elements, zinc and other micronutrients that may be contaminated pretty easily. So again, we want to avoid, and we need to use plastic containers. Plastic buckets are usually ideal. And again, try to use clean containers, bags. You can request really paper bags from the lab for collecting those samples and sending it to the lab. Or many of we also get a lot of samples, for example, from people sending in Ziploc bags. They are, again, as long as they are clean, is really a key. And again, that could be one source of variability that can ultimately affect significantly your recommendations at the end of the day. So that's one component. The other thing is once we are collecting that sample and we are ready to send it, make sure and we handle it properly. Avoid, for example, drying the sample in high temperature in the oven, for example. That can alter some of the nutrients and again, the results you will get will be probably affected. And so we want to avoid that. If in the case of nitrogen analysis, we want to make sure and send that right away. That's very important. If the sample is sitting in somewhere, especially if it is warm, we can have a change in terms of the nitrate content because of organic matter mineralization, and that can again also affect your results. So we want to make sure and send that right away. If that's not going to be possible, the recommendation is typically to dry the sample, air dry, in a clean place, basically just let it air dry without any high temperature. And once it's dry, that sample is usually stable and you can send it to the lab. So that's one alternative. So those are some of the key components that we need to keep in mind. Of course, try to send enough sample. That's always a key. And we kind of touched a little bit already there in terms of how we collecting the samples. Of course, the more sample you collect is the better. And so we want to send usually that sample back nearly full. And again, that's going to be processed by the lab and mix well, ground, dry, and again, we'll have a better representative number from that analysis.
If a producer is taking their own soil sample, they can surely lean on the help of their local extension agricultural agents in as far as technique on collecting and certainly submitting that sample. That can be channeled through local extension offices.
Absolutely. For our lab, that's one of the ways to get the samples to us. Otherwise, many of our producers also send the samples directly to the soil testing lab, and you can get shipping information from the website, even print some shipping label and so on. That will make it easier to get those samples to us.
Well, the soil analysis you receive is only as good as the samples you'd submit. So it's important to go about this the right way. Thanks for the advice, as always. Good to have you by.
Thank you.
Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz with us, Research and Extension Crop Nutrient Specialist at K-State. And you're listening to Agriculture Today. In a moment, we'll speak with another K-State specialist about the utilization of livestock waste as a crop nutrient here in the fall. This is the K-State Radio Network. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Agriculture Today is back now. Eric Atkinson here, and On this segment, we want to fully alert you to an event coming up here on the K-State campus, and in its first 2 years, it has met with tremendous success as the Animal Sciences and Industry Department at K-State has put on what's called the ASI Family and Friends Reunion. The third edition of that is set for Friday, October 13th here on the campus. The head of the Department of Animal Sciences and Industry at K-State, Ken Odde, is Mike's side. Talk about the origins of this, Ken. It got going a couple of years ago, and boy, did it take off well.
It really has, and it's an event that we have been very pleased with to date, but we're even more excited about its future. And its origins really came about within our Livestock and Meat Industry Council, who were looking for a venue to present the Don L. Good Impact Award. And they created this award a few years ago, but for an award to really have impact, you really have to have a venue that's worthy of presenting the award. So the purpose of this event is really twofold. Number one, it's to recognize an individual or organization for significant contributions in agriculture. And number two, to create an opportunity for the friends and family of the department to come back for a fun-filled evening and enjoy the fellowship of all their people that they are connected with, including our employees in the department, our Livestock and Meat Industry Council, and all the people we know across the country that have a connection to this department.
And the response, the first go-round 2 years ago, the second go-round last year was enormous, hundreds and hundreds of people.
Exactly. We've exceeded 1,000 people in each of the first 2 years, and we anticipate at least that many coming this year. The pre-registrations are coming in very nicely. I do really want to emphasize it's a very family-oriented event. We have Junior Wildcat area, which is really a farm playground for the young people, and it is just a wonderful activity. I've had my grandkids here the last 2 years, and I know how good it is because of the feedback I get from them and their parents. So
it's buzzing over there.
It's buzzing over there. We also have the band. The K-State Band has been with us last year. We'll be back this year. And they just do a wonderful show and performance and really light up the evening. And so that's been another great part of the event.
And there's great food there representing each of the species within the animal sciences industry.
Absolutely. Beef, pork, lamb. And this year we're actually honoring Sharon Schwartz. Mm-hmm. Sharon has a long history of leadership in the Kansas swine industry, nationally in the swine industry, and also in the state legislature. And someone very deserving of this recognition that she'll be receiving at this event when we present to her the Don L. Good Impact Award.
She has been a great friend of Kansas State University as a whole, of this department specifically.
Absolutely, very much so.
So Sharon Schwartz, again, will be the recipient of that award as part of the proceedings during the Family and Friends Reunion. The site, by the way, is the Stanley Stout Center toward the north edge of the campus. A registration deadline is this coming Friday, the 29th of September, though, correct?
That is correct. So we encourage you to go to our website and go ahead and get registered. It really helps us with the planning and preparation for the event when people pre-register. If by chance you don't get pre-registered, you still can register at the door, but we would obviously encourage you to pre-register.
That website, and we'll repeat this, is asi.k-state.edu/family and friends. Or, if they'd prefer the old-fashioned way, they can call our good friend Lois Schreiner at the department. 785-532-1267 is Lois's direct number. But, Ken, it's really impressive how well this event has taken root the first 2 years. Looking forward to another edition of it this year. It's just a terrific evening.
Very much so. And I want to especially acknowledge our Livestock and Meat Industry Council. We really have three individuals on that board, Dr. Patsy Houghton, Dr. Justin Jansen, and Bill Miller, longtime loyal K-Staters who put an enormous amount of time into the planning of this event, preparation, fundraising, lining up all the activities for the event. And so we're deeply indebted to that organization for their efforts for this event and the good it does for our department.
By the way, you don't have to be an alum of the department. It is family and friends of the Animal Sciences and Industry Department. So be in Manhattan on Friday, October the 13th for the 2017 Animal Sciences and Industry Family and Friends Reunion at K-State. Looking forward to it, Ken. Thanks for the preview. Right.
Thank you.
He's Ken Odde, the head of the Department of Animal Sciences and Industry at K-State. 2 ways to pre-register for the event: asi.k-state.edu/family and friends. Or again, contact Lois Schreiner by phone 785-532-1267. Those pre-registrations are due this Friday, the 29th of September. Rounding out this segment, each year, teams from across the state compete in an event showcasing the top working ranch cowboys and cowgirls here in Kansas. Todd Domer reports on the winners from the recent State Ranch Rodeo Championships.
Cowboys from Scribner and C5T ranches of El Dorado and Benton won the Kansas Championship Ranch Rodeo September 22nd and 23rd in Medicine Lodge. The team won the ranch bronc riding and team penning on its way to the overall title. Team members were David and Daniel Scribner, Brett Cloud, and Luke Igo, who won the ranch bronc riding. Second place overall was Lazy Bee Ranch of Ellsworth. Lonesome Pine of Cedar Point, last year's state champion, finished third, with Alfalfa County of Sun City placing fourth. Other individual event winners at the Kansas Championships were Lonesome Pine in the wild cow milking and calf branding, and Robbins Ranch and Keith Cattle of Cottonwood Falls and Allen in the stray gathering. The top cowboy was Frank Morton from Snyder and Woolfolk of Wilmore. Justin Peterson with Haywire and Southwestern of El Dorado and Ashland was the reserve top cowboy. For the second year in a row, the top horse at Medicine Lodge was Colonel Patty, owned and ridden by Clint Donnelly with Lazy Bee Ranch. The reserve top horse was Shining Mickey Sue, ridden by Toby Snyder with Snyder and Woolfolk. With the win, Scribner and C5T qualified for the World Championship Ranch Rodeo November 9th through the 12th in Amarillo, Texas. They will join 4 other Kansas teams already qualified for Amarillo, including Beechner Brothers Livestock of St. Paul, Broken H and Heb of Bronson and Fall River, Lonesome Pine, and Robbins Ranch and Keith Cattle. I'm Todd Domer.
Thanks, Todd. And this is Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
Evening came quick, but not so quick that I could not study the busy spider weaving its web.
That's Gus Vanderhoven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Evening did come quick, but not so quick that I couldn't study the busy spider weaving its web. It was dusk, and I was sitting against the cedar tree on the bench and noticed a spider hanging down at the tip of a branch, about 6 feet off the ground. His silhouette was clearly visible against the still, light evening sky, even though the sun had set. Don't ask me the name of the spider, I don't know. It was a small spider, about 1/4 of an inch body size. The rest were legs. It was black, but that might be because evening had fading light. I watched the spider for about half an hour. It was working steadily, no more than 5 feet from me, where it was busy spinning its web between the top of the branch and the ground. I could not see where the threads were attached on the ground, because it was dark. I knew what it was doing, and it continued doing it, breaking the routine by crawling at times horizontal. It surely did not have an 8 to 5 job, as it was working well after 5. It was working by itself. The downslide was just like an elevator or someone who rappels down a cliff and knows what he or she is doing. Then after reaching the low spot, it would climb back up, using its legs one over the other. I never could see the silken thread. I only saw the tiny body, black body, climb back up. If a person had done the same, rappelling down, climbing back up on the silken thread, just spun again and again, he or she would have collapsed, exhausted. And this spider kept at it, even after I left when mosquitoes found me. I told the spider to hurry up and catch some of the boogers, which drew my blood. There was no breeze. At one time, I did watch the spider come down and catch a small breeze and go with the flow. It landed away from its ground zero, but apparently it all was in the scheme of things as it climbed back up, attached the thread to the branch, and went down again. The attaching to the branch, I surmise, as the spider was busy seemingly to tie or wrap the thread. It was fascinating to watch, and I admired the spider working so hard. I know it comes natural to be busy, and it is the way for spiders to collect food, but I wondered if a spider gets tired and rests. I had planned to go and look early the next morning, but don't laugh. I was busy and forgot to go and look. However, when dusk settled again the following evening, sun turned clouds pink and orange, I did step outside, went back to my bench, and looked. The spider was still there, hanging on a thin thread. It was doing nothing. It must have been resting. I very carefully looked to see the web, or threads, spun the evening before. There were no insects caught in the web. I looked carefully, not wanting to destroy the handiwork. Because I left doing the dishes, I had to run back in the house to finish that job. But the fact that Mr. or Madam Spider was still there must have been a good sign. All was well with nature on the hill. Of course, during the day, a low-flying bird might have flown through the web. It's part of the risk of building in a public space. I will get outside early tomorrow morning, and I'll see what the spider built last evening, or rather night. And I do not know if they work at night, or have a 24-hour shift, or just build until the job is done. Just like farmers sowing or harvesting crops, and switching on the tractor lights when it gets dark. Just keep on going. I wonder if a spider senses satisfaction, like the harvest got in before it rained, or any such feeling. Or is the feeling of hunger what drives it to work at the task at hand? Does a spider contemplate the best location to build the web, like man chooses and selects locations of a new dam, making use of mountains, hills, and valleys? Walking the trails, I know that fresh webs are often spun across the open trail. It's a good place to catch food, other insects who travel the open trail. But so do birds, deer, and other mammals. I try hard to duck under or walk past the webs. Only looking at it and studying the hard-working spider the other evening makes me respect the web and avoid it if I can. I must admit that I've stepped in the past and carefully have released a just-caught butterfly, releasing it before the spider could crawl up and encase it in more webbing to make sure the web would hold and dinner would be saved. Maybe a man should not interfere, but when the butterfly fluttered away, I did feel some satisfaction, like having done a good deed. Of course, mosquitoes is a totally different story, and so are flies. Yes, I hear you. You say, not a mosquito, not a fly? I'm sorry, not really. Just too bad. Spiders have to eat too.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas. Featured every Wednesday right here. Our time's away for today. We'd remind you once again that you can hear a podcast of this very program, all of our programs as a matter of fact, featured on our website, ksre.ksu.edu/news. And the interviews and features are also posted there individually for your listening convenience. Again, ksre.ksu.edu/news. Click on the Radio Network tab there. In the meantime, thanks for being along with us right here today. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.